Hey, welcome back. I just realized I am on the wrong. There we go. Okay, welcome back to, sorry, South Asia Part 3. This will be our last lecture for this week. Again, I'm just going to kind of touch on some of the geopolitical situations. Again, this is a very complex region, not quite as complex as our last region. So we'll just kind of talk about some of the major issues that are going on. There's a lot of ethnic conflict. There still is kind of the remnants of, technically, the civil war in Sri Lanka ended about a decade ago. But let's see, it lasted over 20 years, about 20 years more or less. And then we'll talk a little bit more about the Kashmir region as well. A lot of the issues that this region has is actually related to colonial legacies. So at one point, nearly every what is now a state or country in this region previously was under British rule at one point. So you still have a lot of borders and there are some issues that there are areas that are claimed by China or areas, so there is some conflict with China. It's actually the red lined areas. So there are areas claimed by one country and controlled by another. Up in Kashmir, we'll talk about in the purple region, the conflict. And again, this is largely related to colonial rule. Even Pakistan, which most people aren't aware of, was actually a British colony at one point, and Pakistan was actually part of Bangladesh was part of Pakistan until they gained independence in the early 1970s. So we'll talk about some of these issues, but we're just going to kind of glance over a lot of them and not go into anything in super depth. So there were different empires that had rule over the majority of this area at different times. Previously, it was the Mughal Empire, and there were different colonies at different times. The Dutch and French had maintained colonial possessions, as well as the Portuguese. Actually, Goa, which we talked about in part 2, was a Dutch colony until the British pretty much gained control over almost the entire region, realistically speaking. So you can see after the Mughal Empire, we've got British India, which most of you are familiar with, like Mahatma Gandhi, for example. There was a lot of, so Britain took a very, I think probably somewhat of a strategic and realistic approach to colonial rule of British, or of India, British India. What they called was the whole entire region except for Bhutan and Nepal. They maintained a lot of independence. Pakistan, especially, for example, the British government actually let a lot of the tribes, the Pashtun tribes, for example, maintain independence. They kind of gave them enough power, and this was actually a strategy that Pakistan, once it became an independent country, continued. And it was actually this independence that, I'm not proposing a different strategy, but it was these areas, these tribal areas in the north of Pakistan, which there's been a lot of warring tribes and clans, and these were actually a lot of these tribes that supported the Taliban and Al Qaeda as well. So again, this approach that Pakistan has taken to ruling the northern tribal areas is actually a colonial legacy. So it's still the same type of colonial infrastructure and political ruling that the British had employed. And then down south, the bottom picture is, so we were taking from 1700 to 1900 to 2000, where we can actually see the independent countries. And I think I have another map. So at one point, Pakistan and Bangladesh were actually one in the same country, and then eventually they gained independence. You can see part of India is separated as well. Okay, so just kind of to glance over, so India gained independence. It was a British mission in many ways, the British conquest, they call it, where little by little they gained political rule over the region until it was formalized as a colony. And this was largely, there was the East India Company, most of you are probably familiar with or have heard of at some point in some type of history class, was a private company, but it helped maintain a lot of the rule and the control as well. And then it was in 1947 that the region gained independence, and there was a lot of argument. So Mahatma Gandhi, for example, who is usually the figure of the Indian independence movement, he wanted a unified India. So including, remember, as a colony, it was Pakistan, Bangladesh. Let's go back here. It was all of these countries, right? The different colors. Well, you have Portuguese control, which was basically Goa. It's too small to see on here. Your book has this. Yellow, so Bhutan and Nepal were British protectorates. Direct British rule were the green areas, and Indian states via indirect British rule were the orange. So all of what is today Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan, as well as Sri Lanka, were technically British colonies at one point. And so he wanted to, there was a big group of people who wanted the whole entire region to maintain an independent country, but a unified country. And then there were a lot of people as well that wanted a separation, and predominantly a separation between more along ethnic lines, which ethnic lines are also religious lines, or largely speaking religious lines. So they wanted a separation between basically the Muslim and the Hindu populations, which is ultimately what happened. So they did divide the country into Pakistan and East Pakistan, it was called Bangladesh, which are predominantly Muslim, and then the rest was Hindi. But this was not an easy process because there were still a lot of mixed populations within the country. I think it was well over 1 million people were massacred in the process. A lot of internally displaced people, a lot of refugees, because all of a sudden, boom, these borders are formed, countries are formed, and there was a lot of ethnic tensions, and people were fleeing to, for example, Muslims living in India were fleeing to Pakistan, as well as Hindus living in Pakistan were fleeing to India, or the same with Bangladesh and India. So today we have a federal state. One of the areas that, let me give you, I'll go back here to a bigger map. You can see Pakistan, India, China, Nepal. So it's this tip back here. I'm going to go back to the other map so you can see this tip up here. So this is what we call the Kashmir region. Pretty sure there's a question on your exam about this. Okay, sorry, just want to make sure I didn't have any text pulled up. So the orange area you see is area that's claimed by India but controlled by China. I don't think it's really hard to find a region in the world, especially with China being a neighbor country, but not have a conflict with China, at least for the next few units. This area, the yellow, is claimed by India but controlled by Pakistan. The green area is claimed by Pakistan but controlled by India. So Pakistan thinks it owns all of this. India thinks it owns all of this, including this. And then there's a separate, which I'm not going to talk about that. But the red line is actually the boundary. So it's a highly contested boundary, but for the most part, it has largely been respected. And I think it's just been respected because neither side has really been that successful in gaining control of the other side. So what really has come down to is it's a colonial legacy. So these were lands, and again, it depends on which of the populations. So you have Muslim populations living over here, you have Hindu populations living over here, and it's just this long-standing conflict. It's not really something that you hear about very much in the media. There have been, it's a militarized area. There's a lot of troops there, or soldiers to some extent, whether they be rebels or national sanctioned troops. But it is a highly contentious area. There's a lot of ethnic tension. A lot of areas in northern India as well. I know occasionally I'll come across news articles where, if I'm not mistaken, I forgot what it is. I believe it's the Indian women that live there, and the women will be jumped and assaulted in the street, and their hair will be cut off, which is, it's a very prized possession for these women to have their long hair. I believe it's in braids, and they're attacked and it's cut off, which is, it's, I don't know how, I mean, culturally speaking, it's, I mean, it's a violation of space and trust, but it goes beyond that since the hair is a huge connection to people's identity. So in this region, generally in the north, there is a lot of ethnic conflict as well. Not just in the Kashmir region, but definitely the Kashmir region. A couple other areas of conflict I'm just going to kind of briefly touch on. There's also a lot of ethnic conflict against the Indian Bangladesh side as well, the border up there. There's on the Bangladesh actually also has a lot of, not necessarily conflict, but they have a major refugee and internally displaced person problem. They have a lot of the Rohingya, which we'll talk about when we get to next week with Southeast Asia, or Muslim refugees, and they're fleeing Myanmar or Burma to make it to Bangladesh. But we'll get into that next week. But that's another issue that Bangladesh has as well. With it's not only internally displaced people, largely related to the natural disasters, but they have a lot of refugees coming across the border. And I'm just going to briefly talk about the civil war in Sri Lanka. Again, this was colonial legacy, so they gained independence in about the same time. Actually, I should go back and touch briefly as well about Pakistan. I forgot to mention that. So Pakistan and Bangladesh were the same country. They were Pakistan and East Pakistan. It was an exclave, if you remember exclave. And basically, Bangladesh felt as like second-class citizens within this country. It's very hard to maintain control over half of your country. For example, Alaska does not want to be part of the United States. It's going to be a little bit hard to control them, especially with really impoverished countries. It's a little bit different in our situation. And so I think it was about 1971, Bangladesh wanted independence, or what today is Bangladesh, East Pakistan at the time, wanted independence from Pakistan, and they were supported by Indian troops and were able to successfully gain independence. I believe it was in the early 1970s. I want to say 1971, but I'm not. I think it was 1971. So anyways, the civil war in Sri Lanka. So you have, again, it's ethnic tensions. Basically, you have the Tamil group, which are um, Hindus, and you have the Sinhalese, which are Buddhists. So you have linguistic differences and as well as religious differences. With that ethnic and culture as well as. So again, it was a similar situation coming back from colonial legacies, and once they'd gained independence, there had been continually conflict for a few decades, and then it was in the early 1990s that a group of Tamil rebels went and attacked the soldiers, the national soldiers, and there was more or less a civil war that ensued for quite a while. It wasn't really, I think, solved or resolved until about 10 years ago, more or less, maybe a little bit even less than that. It was it's something your book barely talks about this issue. It was quite a bloody conflict. A lot of people died. In the end, they found that both sides had committed war crimes. But yeah, so it's a lot better now. It's a lot more peaceful, but obviously 20 years of conflict is not something that is just erased quickly overnight. So economic and social development. You can see here we have on the left, we have the GNI per capita. So there's quite a big difference. Nothing is super large. Maldives has the largest GNI, just like the GDP, but including remittances. Bangladesh is the lowest. Actually, Nepal, sorry, is the lowest. GDP, average annual percentage of growth. India has quite a high growth rate, which is not surprising. India has a very strong growing economy, and it has for quite a while now. Human Development Index. So remember, the higher the number, the higher the quality of life. Nepal, not surprisingly, is quite low. Most are about 50s. Sri Lanka is a little bit higher. Maldives is a little bit higher. Percentage of the population living below $2 a day. This is, look at Bangladesh. We talked about it being a very poor country. India, 68% of the country, more than 2/3. Nepal, almost 2/3, 57%. Pakistan, 60% of the country. These are very poor countries. This is one of, I don't want to see, when we talk about sub-Saharan Africa and we talk about, I think more often we associate that region as being a poor region, but this is more a persistent type of, a desperate type of poverty. Life expectancy, surprisingly, is not that low. 65 being the lowest is really not that low. Under age 5 mortality rates, so going from 1990 to 2010, so over this 20-year period, there has been a lot of improvements. Some countries still aren't that great. Pakistan is still pretty high. India is still pretty high as well. Adult literacy, realistically, except for the Maldives and Sri Lanka, it's pretty low. This is also access to education is a major factor. Gender equality, so remember, the higher the number, the greater the inequality. So the lower the number, the better the equality. So India is not surprising with 0.61. Pakistan, Nepal are not that much better. Bangladesh also not that much better. And we'll talk about some of these issues in a minute here. So, as I kind of just mentioned, the poverty level that we see in this country, 2/3 of the people of India living on less than $2 a day, as we mentioned, not just India. No other region has so many chronically undernourished people. However, there is a growing middle class, which is very promising, and there is a healthy economy. Of course, this does not trickle down to everybody, but we are seeing overall general improvements. Some of the emerging industries that we've seen, again, the more you can diversify are some of the factors as well that have led to economic development. Tourism has found quite the niche in Nepal, specifically those that want to climb the Himalayas, Mount Everest. You have the Grameen Bank. The Grameen Bank it's been around, I want to say, since the 1990s, at least for almost 20 years now. It's in Bangladesh, and it's basically microfinancing. It was where this concept of low interest and microfinancing really took off. And it was predominantly oriented towards women. So giving women small loans, microfinancing, at low interest rates so that they could start their own business, or they could, buy materials that they needed for agriculture, for whatever it was. But it was really trying to improve the economy from a bottom-up approach, but improving the livelihood and the quality of life of families, but via directly female members. And the Gujarat factory, so Gujarat area of India it's got one of the longer standing histories of textile manufacturing, as you can see the picture here. There's this region, not just this specific area, but this region in general, as well as Bangladesh, has a very strong hold, partially because of cheap labor, but they have a very strong hold on the textile industry. If you look in a lot of your garments that you buy, a lot of them are actually probably at least partially made in Bangladesh. India has also found a very niche market, and this is partly because it was previous British colony. They speak English. Not everybody, but a larger percentage of the population speaks English, and this has really allowed them to tap into different sectors that don't necessarily require a lot of investment. So they have, instead of our Silicon Valley, they have Silicon Plateau. They also have a lot of institutes of technology. Again, technology is something, coding, it doesn't require necessarily a lot of startup money. And this is something that this India particularly has definitely found a niche for. A couple other factors. So historically, this region has been making movements towards self-sufficiency, which is really important, especially regarding the size of the population, but largely becoming more self-sufficient since its independence. I think it was in 1947. But realistically, it wasn't until the early 1990s that the government actually opened its economy to the world. And since then, this is when we've really started to see the advancements in their development, economic development again. But so this is, they're finding a niche. So I mentioned the other day, we've got 4 countries we refer to as the BRIC countries: Brazil, Russia, India, and China. And these are semi-peripheral countries that are seeing, or peripheral as well, that are having this massive growth their um, in their economies and development as well. And along with this has come social development as well. India still, as we saw previously, as we've seen with other regions as well, the diaspora. So a lot of people, a lot of workers still go abroad and send back remittances. A huge part of the Bangladesh economy, the Bengali economy, also is reliant on remittances coming back into the country from people working abroad. Social development. I think this is a very important topic for this region. One that I would really love to spend more time on, but we just really don't have a lot of time. So overall health and education differ drastically between the more and less developed areas of this region, as we see with every region. The south of this region, so Sri Lanka, southern India, definitely tends to be more educated, whereas the north is not. They don't have the same access to education. I think the gender relations and the status of women in this region is a very important topic. I'm hoping most of you have at least heard in the news and aware of some of the gender issues. For Pakistan, it's still a situation where aren't girls able to access education? Can they go to schools? This is a major concern. India, not so much. I mean, there is um, a lot of limited access for girls. Um, in Pakistan, for example, particularly, we have Malala. She was shot by, I want to say it was Taliban. I can't not specifically remember, Al Qaeda, because she was trying to go to school and she was being an advocate for females to go to school. But specifically regarding the status of women in India, it's still a country so much like we saw with China, where there's high rates of female infanticide. Also, sonograms, I think, are supposed to be completely illegal in India because people selectively choose to have males over females, and this is related to the now illegal system of having to pay a dowry for females to be able to have them get married. So a lot of females have been killed as babies or even as fetuses still. So again, we're seeing a huge disproportionate populations, males over females. Females, there's constantly you hear of females being gang raped on buses, for example, trying to make it home from school or from work in a factory, and nothing happens. This is still a region where you will find, women can be, I don't want to say forced to marry, but there are cases of women being forced to marry somebody, so it is still you don't choose who you marry. This is for men and for women. But there is a very high rate, one of the highest rates in the world, of female suicide rates because a lot of females will be forced to marry somebody and they are treated as property and treated as a slave. And oftentimes their lives are so horrible that they prefer to kill themselves. There are so many amazing documentaries about this topic. It's something, again, we could have a whole entire course on it, but I highly encourage you to read up a little bit more, look for some documentaries. It's a very, very important topic in this world, especially in this region. And they've done a lot of interesting studies as well, where they have found that if we go in and we provide women with education regarding family planning, and we provide them with access to birth control options, that women, once they are able to actually control their own bodies and control their family planning, They found that not only has the economic and social conditions of the women in the community improved drastically, but also the ecological impacts of the people living in this region. They've done some interesting studies regarding deforestation, because a lot of this region still relies on burning wood, for example, for cooking. Um, Toilets and access to toilets is another really fascinating topic that, again, I just wish we had a lot more time to talk about. So here is your summary. So if you're not, and let me know if you have any questions. Have a great week.